Mei Lin Chen had traveled 8,000 miles across an ocean and half a continent to reach this moment. But as the Union Pacific locomotive shuddered to a halt at Silver Creek Station, she wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and dust, so different from the gray mists of San Francisco's Chinatown, where she'd spent the last 3 years of her exile. She clutched her small leather satchel tighter, feeling the weight of her grandmother's jade bracelet hidden in the bottom. The only thing of value she had left from her old life in Canton. Everything else had been sacrificed for this moment. Her silk merchant father's reputation, her arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, her family's honor. All of it abandoned for the desperate hope that somewhere in the American frontier, a woman could choose her own destiny. The other passengers had already disembarked, leaving her alone in the railway car with her racing heart and her perfectly rehearsed English phrases. She'd practiced them for weeks during the journey west. "Hello, I am Maylene. Thank you for your kindness. I will be good wife." Simple words for a complicated woman, but Caleb Morgan's letters had suggested he wanted simplicity, a quiet, obedient bride who would tend his house and ask no questions about the world beyond his ranch. What he didn't know, what she'd carefully hidden in her responses, was that Mei Lin Chen had been educated by Presbyterian missionaries, spoke English as well as any frontier schoolmarm, and possessed a spirit that her grandmother had once described as too large for any man's house to contain. But desperation had taught her to make herself small, to hide her light under the humble appearance of a traditional Chinese bride. Through the window, she could see him waiting on the platform, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly under his worn cowboy hat. Caleb Morgan looked exactly like the photograph he'd sent, except the camera hadn't captured the gentleness in his eyes or the nervous way he kept adjusting his hat brim. He was scanning the train cars with the expression of a man who wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. Taking a deep breath that tasted of coal smoke and sagebrush, Maylin stepped down from the train into a world that would either embrace her or destroy her. Her silk slippers touched American soil for the first time, and she felt the weight of every choice that had led her here. The midnight escape from her father's house, the terrifying ocean voyage, the lonely weeks in San Francisco's boarding house, where desperate women wrote letters to stranger men who promised new lives in exchange for companionship. "Miss Chen." Caleb's voice was deeper than she'd expected, tinged with a nervousness that somehow made her feel less alone. She looked up at him, this American cowboy who'd agreed to marry a woman he'd never met, and saw something in his face that she hadn't dared hope for. Respect. Not the calculating assessment she'd grown used to from men who saw Chinese women as exotic curiosities, but genuine human regard. "Yes," she replied carefully, letting her accent thicken just slightly. "I am Mei Lin." What neither of them realized in that moment was that everything they thought they knew about each other was about to be proven wrong. Caleb expected a docile wife who would gratefully accept whatever life he offered. Maylin expected a rough frontiersman who would see her as nothing more than a housekeeper and bearer of sons. Instead, they were about to discover that love had nothing to do with expectations and everything to do with the courage to see beyond what you thought you wanted to find what you actually needed. Because sometimes the greatest journeys begin, not when you leave home, but when you finally find the place and the person brave enough to let you be yourself. In the growing twilight of Silver Creek Station, with the locomotive's whistle echoing across the vast Montana sky, two worlds were about to collide in the most beautiful way possible. The ride to Caleb's ranch passed in a silence that somehow managed to be both comfortable and excruciating. Malin sat beside him on the wagon seat, acutely aware of his every movement, the way his hands held the reins with gentle confidence, how he glanced at her sideways when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful space he maintained between them on the bench. She wanted to tell him that the landscape was beautiful, that the endless sky reminded her of the scroll paintings her grandmother had shown her as a child. She wanted to ask about the cattle dotting the distant hills, about the mountains that rose like sleeping dragons on the horizon. Instead, she kept her eyes downcast and her mouth shut, playing the part of the modest Chinese bride who spoke only when spoken to. "It's not much," Caleb said finally as they crested a low hill and his ranch came into view. "But it's home." Malin looked up to see a modest house of weathered wood and stone, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of a man who worked hard but alone. It was nothing like her father's silk-draped house in Canton, or even the cramped but lively boarding house in San Francisco's Chinatown. This was purely American, practical, sturdy, and somehow achingly lonely. "Is good," she said carefully, letting her voice carry the hesitant cadence she'd practiced. "Very big." Caleb's face brightened at her approval, and Maylin felt a stab of guilt at how easily pleased he seemed. "Wait until you see inside. I tried to clean up some, but I'm not much of a housekeeper." The understatement became apparent the moment they crossed the threshold. The house wasn't dirty exactly, but it carried the unmistakable air of a place where a man had been living alone for too long. Dishes were clean, but stacked haphazardly. Books lay open on tables where they had been abandoned mid-read. A sock hung forgotten over the back of a chair. "I know it needs a woman's touch," Caleb said, his voice carrying an embarrassment that made Maylin's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I wasn't sure what you'd... That is, I didn't know what you might need." Maylin nodded and began to move through the room, running her fingers along surfaces and taking inventory with the sharp eyes of someone who'd been managing households since she was 12. The kitchen was adequate, the sitting room comfortable if cluttered, and everything spoke of a man who tried but lacked the knowledge that came from growing up in a house full of women. "Where I sleep?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the way his face flushed. Well, there's only the one bedroom," Caleb admitted, "but I fixed up a place for myself in the barn loft. I figured you'd want your privacy, at least until..." He trailed off, his cheeks growing redder. Until they were truly married, Maylin understood. Until they knew each other well enough for the intimacy their legal union implied. She felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration, even as part of her wondered what it would be like to share more than a name with this gentle American cowboy. "You are a kind man," she said, and meant it more than he could possibly know. That evening, Caleb attempted to cook dinner while Maylin sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly mending one of his shirts, but actually watching him work with fascination. He moved around the kitchen with the determined clumsiness of someone who'd taught himself to cook out of necessity rather than love. And the results were exactly what she'd expected. Barely edible beef, potatoes that were burned on the outside and raw in the center, and coffee that could strip paint. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting across from her with a grimace after tasting his own handiwork. "I know it's not what you're used to. I was hoping maybe you could... That is, do you know how to cook?" The question was asked with such hopeful hesitancy that Maylin almost abandoned her careful act right then and there. She wanted to tell him that she'd learned to cook from her grandmother, who could make poetry out of rice and vegetables. She wanted to show him how to balance flavors the way her culture had been perfecting for thousands of years. Instead, she nodded shyly and said, "I learn." "You teach?" "I'm probably not the best teacher," Caleb admitted with a self-deprecating laugh, "but we'll figure it out together." Together. The word sent an unexpected warmth through Maylin's chest. The next few days fell into an awkward rhythm of mutual adjustment. Caleb left early each morning to tend his cattle, leaving Maylin alone in the house with instructions delivered in the slow, careful English of someone speaking to a child. She found herself both touched by his consideration and frustrated by his assumptions. While he was gone, she explored the house with the thoroughness of someone who intended to make it truly home. She found his collection of books, mostly practical volumes about ranching and farming, but also a few novels that suggested a man who dreamed of adventures beyond his own fence lines. She discovered his attempts at keeping accounts, which were honest but disorganized in a way that made her fingers itch to apply the systematic approach her father had taught her. Most telling of all, she found the letters. Her letters, carefully saved in a wooden box in his bedroom. Letters in which she'd presented herself as barely literate, grateful for any kindness, eager to please. Reading them now, in her own carefully simple handwriting, made her face burn with shame at the deception. But it was too late to change course now. Each day that passed made the truth harder to reveal, and Caleb seemed so pleased with her gentle compliance that she couldn't bear to shatter his contentment with the reality of who she actually was. Their first real crisis came on the fourth day, when Mei Lin accidentally knocked over a jar of preserves while cleaning and responded with a string of frustrated Cantonese that would have made a dock worker blush. Caleb, who just walked through the door, stood frozen in the doorway. The rapid-fire syllables fell into silence as Mei Lin realized her mistake. Sorry, she stammered, reverting to her careful broken English. I clean. No worry, but Caleb's eyes had sharpened with something that might have been understanding. He approached slowly, as if she were a spooked horse that might bolt at any sudden movement. Malin, he said gently, how long have you been speaking English? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Malin felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble, and with it, all her hopes for the safety this marriage had promised. She could lie again, make excuses, pretend she'd only learned a few phrases from other passengers on the train, or she could trust this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness since the moment she'd stepped off that train. Long time, she whispered finally, her accent fading as the truth escaped. Since I was child in mission school. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to squirm. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Why did you pretend you couldn't? The simple question broke something loose in Malin's chest. All the fear and desperation that had driven her across an ocean came pouring out in words that tumbled over each other in their hurry to be heard. Because men want stupid wife, she said, her real voice emerging clear and strong. They want women who say yes, who ask no questions, who grateful for anything. I think you same as others. I think if you know I can read your books, keep your accounts, have opinions about your politics, you send me back to San Francisco. And San Francisco send me back to father, who sell me to old man like I am livestock. The silence that followed felt endless. Maylin watched Caleb's face, trying to read the emotions that flickered across it. Surprise, hurt, something that might have been disappointment. So you thought I was that kind of man, he said finally. I not know what kind of man you are, Maylin replied honestly. I only know what kind of men I met before. Caleb nodded slowly, as if her answer explained something that had been puzzling him. When he looked at her again, there was something different in his eyes. Not the careful gentleness he'd been showing the woman he thought she was, but genuine curiosity about the woman she actually might be. Well then, he said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table, I guess we'd better start over. Hello, Maylin. I'm Caleb Morgan. It's a pleasure to meet you. And despite everything, the deception, the uncertainty, the complete upheaval of both their expectations, Maylin found herself smiling as she sat down across from him. Hello, Caleb, she said in her clear, unaccented English. The pleasure is entirely mine. The morning after Maylin's revelation dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline light that made the Montana landscape look like it had been painted by angels. She woke in the bedroom that still felt too large and too empty, listening to the sounds of Caleb moving around in the kitchen below. For the first time since arriving, she didn't have to rehearse her broken English or practice her humble expressions before facing him. When she came downstairs, she found him standing over the stove with a look of intense concentration, apparently attempting to make pancakes. The results looked like abstract art, some burned, some raw, all of them distinctly lopsided. May I? She asked, and when he looked up with relief and stepped aside, she took over with the unconscious competence of someone who'd been cooking since childhood. My grandmother always said cooking was like painting, Maylin said as she adjusted the heat and cleaned the pan. Too much fire and you burn the canvas. Too little and nothing beautiful can emerge. Caleb watched her work with fascination, noting how her movements had a precise grace that spoke of years of practice. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She taught me that a woman's strength isn't measured by how quiet she can be, but by how much beauty she can bring into the world. Maylin poured perfect circles of batter into the pan. I think she would have liked you. Even though I'm the American cowboy who stole her granddaughter? Maylin glanced at him, surprised by the hint of uncertainty in his voice. She would have said you didn't steal me. She would have said I chose you, and that makes all the difference. As they ate breakfast, pancakes that were actually edible for the first time since she'd arrived, Caleb asked the question she'd been dreading. So what else don't I know about my wife? wife. The word still felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Malin set down her fork and considered how to answer. I can read and write in 3 languages, she began carefully. I know mathematics well enough to keep books for a business. I have opinions about politics that would probably scandalize half the men in Silver Creek. And I left China not just to escape an arranged marriage, but because I wanted to see if the stories about American freedom were true. What kind of stories? That a woman could own property, that she could speak her mind without bringing shame to her family, that she could choose her own path. Malin met his eyes across the table. I wanted to believe it was possible, even for someone like me. Caleb was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Someone like you? Chinese, foreign, different. She gestured to herself with a self-deprecating smile. Not exactly what most American men picture when they think of the ideal wife. Most American men are idiots, Caleb said with such matter-of-fact certainty that Mei Lin nearly choked on her coffee. Besides, I didn't advertise for an ideal wife. I advertised for a partner. Is that what you want? A partner? I've been running this ranch alone for 3 years, Caleb replied. I've fixed fences alone, balanced books alone, made decisions alone, and eaten terrible food alone. If I'd wanted to keep doing everything by myself, I wouldn't have placed that advertisement. The honesty in his voice made something warm unfold in Malin's chest. Then perhaps you could show me the books, if you don't mind me looking at them. An hour later, Malin sat at Caleb's desk with his ledgers spread before her, trying not to wince at the creative approach he'd taken to accounting. His heart was clearly in the right place, and his record-keeping was scrupulously honest. But the organization left much to be desired. You're not saying anything, Caleb observed from where he sat nearby, apparently fascinated by watching her work. Is it that bad? It's not bad, Malin said diplomatically. It's just very American. What does that mean? Direct, straightforward, no unnecessary flourishes. She looked up at him with a smile. But perhaps we could add a little structure to help you see the patterns more clearly. For the next 2 hours, Mei Lin reorganized Caleb's accounts with a methodical precision that revealed the ranch's finances in ways he'd never seen before. She created categories, balanced columns, and identified trends that showed him exactly where his money was going and, more importantly, where it could be saved. How did you learn all this? Caleb asked, watching her elegant handwriting transform his chaotic records into something that looked almost professional. My father was a silk merchant. He believed that knowledge of numbers was the foundation of all success, so he taught me alongside my brothers. Malin paused in her writing. Until he decided I knew too much for a woman and that it was time to marry me off to someone who would appreciate my domestic qualities more than my mind. His loss, Caleb said firmly. This is incredible, Malin. You've just saved me hours of work and probably hundreds of dollars. The praise sent a flush of pride through her that she hadn't felt since leaving her father's house. In China, they say that a good partnership is like 2 chopsticks, useless alone, but together they can accomplish anything. I like that, Caleb said, though I have to admit I'm not very good with chopsticks. I could teach you if you'd like. Along with some other things. What kind of other things? Malin gestured around the house, taking in the functional but uninspiring space. How to make this place feel like a home instead of just a place where you sleep. How to cook food that doesn't taste like leather. How to... She paused, suddenly uncertain. If you want me to, that is. I don't want to change everything you love about this place. Caleb stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch he'd built with his own hands. When he turned back to her, his expression was serious. Malin, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about expecting me to be like other men you'd met. The truth is, I made assumptions about you too. I thought I was getting a quiet little wife who would be grateful for whatever life I could provide, someone who would make this place feel less empty without asking me to be anything more than I already was. And now I'm realizing that what I thought I wanted and what I actually need might be 2 very different things. He came back to the desk, his eyes meeting hers. I don't want a wife who's grateful for scraps. I want a partner who challenges me to be better than I am. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Malin felt her heart racing as she recognized the moment for what it was, a choice point that would determine not just the shape of their marriage, but the people they would become together. "That sounds wonderful," she said softly, "and terrifying." "Why terrifying?" "Because what if we try to build something real together and it doesn't work? What if we discover we're too different, or that we want different things from life?" Caleb reached across the desk and covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. "Then we'll figure it out together." "That's what partners do, right?" Before Mei Lin could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the window, they could see 3 riders coming up the path to the house. Silver Creek's sheriff and 2 men she didn't recognize. "Stay here," Caleb said, his voice suddenly tense as he reached for the rifle he kept by the door. But Mei Lin was already standing, her instincts honed by years of recognizing danger. "No, if this concerns me, and I suspect it does, then we face it together." They stepped onto the porch or side by side as the riders approached. Sheriff Clayton dismounted with the swagger of a man who enjoyed his authority a little too much, while his companions, rough-looking men with calculating eyes, remained in their saddles. "Morgan," Clayton said without preamble, "we need to talk." "About what?" "About your Chinese bride. See, we've had some complaints from upstanding citizens about bringing foreign elements into our community. Questions about whether this arrangement is even legal." Mei Lin felt ice form in her stomach. She'd known this moment would come, had been dreading it since she'd first decided to answer Caleb's advertisement. In America, as in China, there were always men who believed they had the right to control women's choices. "Our marriage is completely legal," Caleb said, his voice steady but cold. "We have all the proper documents." "Maybe so, but that doesn't address the bigger concerns. This is a decent, God-fearing community, Morgan. People are worried about what kind of influence this woman might have, what kind of customs she might try to introduce." "What customs would those be, Sheriff?" Malin stepped forward, her accent carefully neutralized, her posture straight with dignity. "The custom of keeping accurate financial records? The custom of cooking edible food? Or perhaps the custom of treating one's spouse as an equal partner rather than a possession?" The sheriff's eyes widened slightly at her clear, unaccented English and the steel in her voice. Clearly, he'd expected the demure, barely speaking woman that Silver Creek's gossips had described. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Caleb interrupted, moving to stand beside Mei Lin. "This is my property, this is my wife, and this is my business. Unless you have an actual legal complaint to make, I suggest you and your friends ride back to town and find something more productive to do with your time." The tension stretched taut between the men, and Mei Lin realized that this confrontation was about more than just prejudice. It was about power, respect, and the right to choose one's own path in a world that wanted to make those choices for you. "This isn't over, Morgan," Clayton said finally, remounting his horse. "There are a lot of concerned citizens in Silver Creek. We'll be keeping an eye on things." As the 3 men rode away, Mei Lin felt Caleb's hand find hers. The simple contact steadied her, reminding her that she wasn't facing this alone. "Well," she said, trying to keep her voice light despite the fear coursing through her veins, "I suppose we're about to find out just how strong our partnership really is." "I suppose we are," Caleb agreed. "But Mei Lin? Whatever comes next, we face it together. That's a promise." The town's hostility became apparent the very next day when Mei Lin accompanied Caleb to Silver Creek for supplies. She dressed carefully in her most modest American dress, a simple blue cotton that she'd purchased in San Francisco. But the stares that followed her down Main Street made it clear that no amount of Western clothing could disguise what the townspeople saw as her fundamental foreignness. "Just ignore them," Caleb murmured as they approached the general store, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. "They'll get used to you." But even Caleb's optimism was tested when Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, pointedly turned her back as they entered and began loudly discussing with another customer how certain people were bringing heathen influences into their Christian community. Malin felt her face burn with shame and anger, but she forced herself to speak politely when Mr. Henderson reluctantly served them. She kept her voice soft and her request reasonable, hoping to prove through behavior what words couldn't seem to convey, that she was simply a woman trying to build a life, not some exotic threat to their way of living. Sugar, flour, coffee, she said carefully, consulting the list she'd written, and perhaps some fabric for curtains? Mr. Henderson's response was to quote prices that were easily twice what they should have been. Before Caleb could protest, Maylin placed a gentle hand on his arm and paid without complaint, understanding instinctively that making a scene would only confirm their worst assumptions about her. But their restraint didn't go unnoticed. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, a woman approached them, middle-aged, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Mrs. Morgan?" Her voice was tentative but warm. "I'm Maria Gonzalez. My husband and I run the cantina at the end of town." Maylin looked up in surprise, recognizing the Spanish accent and the olive complexion that marked Maria as another outsider in this predominantly Anglo community. "Senora Gonzalez," Maylin replied, unconsciously switching to the formal address her mission school education had taught her. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Maria's eyes lit up with understanding. "You speak Spanish?" "A little." The missionaries in San Francisco believed in comprehensive education. "Then you must come to dinner tomorrow night, both of you," Maria said, including Caleb in her invitation with a warm smile. "My Eduardo makes the best enchiladas this side of the Rio Grande, and I suspect you could use some friendly faces right about now." The simple kindness of the invitation nearly brought tears to Maylene's eyes. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." As they drove home, Caleb was unusually quiet. Finally, Maylin asked what was troubling him. "I never realized how bad it could be," he admitted. "I mean, I knew some folks might be uncomfortable at first, but the way they looked at you, the way Henderson treated us." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Maylin. I should have prepared you better." "You cannot prepare someone for hatred," she replied gently. "You can only decide how you respond to it. And today you responded by standing beside me. That means more than you know." That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Maylin began teaching Caleb to use chopsticks. It was an exercise in patience for both of them. His large, calloused hands struggled with the delicate implements, while she fought the urge to simply take over and show him the proper technique. "Like this," she said, adjusting his grip for the 12th time. "Think of them as an extension of your fingers, not separate tools." "At this rate, I'm going to starve," Caleb muttered, trying unsuccessfully to pick up a grain of rice. "In China, we have a saying, 'The master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried,'" Maylin said with a laugh. "You're supposed to struggle at first. Do you have sayings for everything? My grandmother did. She believed that wisdom passed down through generations was more valuable than gold." Maylin's expression grew thoughtful. "She used to say that a marriage was like learning to dance. At first you step on each other's toes, but eventually you find your rhythm." "Are we finding our rhythm?" Caleb asked, finally managing to successfully transport a piece of food to his mouth. "I think we're beginning to," Maylin admitted, "though I suspect the real test is still coming." She was right. The next morning brought Dr. Samuel Hayes to their door, his face grave with concern. "Caleb, Maylin," he said, removing his hat as they invited him inside. "I felt I should warn you. There's talk in town about organizing some kind of intervention." "What kind of intervention?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "Nothing violent, Doctor," Hayes assured them quickly. "At least, I don't think so. But Sheriff Clayton and some of the town council are talking about bringing in a territorial judge to examine the legality of your marriage. They're claiming that marriages between whites and Chinese might not be recognized under territorial law." Maylin felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. Can they do that? Legally? It's complicated. Territorially, there's no explicit law against it, but Dr. Hayes looked uncomfortable. There are precedents from other states that might be cited. And even if your marriage is ultimately upheld, the process could be unpleasant. After Dr. Hayes left, Maylin and Caleb sat in their kitchen, the weight of potential disaster settling around them like fog. "We could leave," Caleb said finally, Pack up, sell the ranch, start over somewhere else. Maybe California, where there are more Chinese families. Is that what you want? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. I don't want to run. This is our home, our life. We shouldn't have to hide from ignorant people who are afraid of what they don't understand. Then we fight, Maylene said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. But I need to know, are you fighting for me or for the principal? The question caught Caleb off guard. He looked at her across the table, really looked at her, taking in the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in her posture, the way she faced adversity with dignity instead of despair. Both, he said honestly, but mostly for you, for us, for whatever this is becoming between us. What is it becoming? Caleb stood up and walked around the table, stopping beside her chair. When she looked up at him, he reached out to touch her face with gentle fingers. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I know I want to find out. I know that these past few days working together, talking together, facing problems together, it's felt more like a real marriage than anything I ever imagined when I placed that advertisement. Even though I'm not what you expected, especially because you're not what I expected. Caleb's thumb traced the line of her cheek. Maylin, when I wrote that advertisement, I thought I wanted a quiet, simple woman who would make my life easier. Instead, I got a brilliant, complicated woman who's making my life infinitely more interesting. Interesting can be dangerous, she warned, though she didn't pull away from his touch. So can boring, Caleb replied. And I've been bored for a very long time. When he leaned down to kiss her, it was with the careful reverence of a man who understood that he was being given something precious. Malin's response was tentative at first, then warmer as she realized that this was her choice, her decision, her first freely given kiss. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Well, Malin said shakily, that was definitely not boring. Caleb laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet kitchen. No, it definitely wasn't. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and both of them knew that their troubles were far from over. But inside their kitchen, with the taste of their first kiss still sweet on their lips, Malin and Caleb felt like they could face whatever came next. After all, they were partners now in every sense of the word, bound not just by legal documents, but by choice, by respect, and by the growing certainty that some things, some people, were worth fighting for. The question was, would love be enough to overcome the hatred that was gathering against them like those storm clouds on the horizon? Only time would tell, but for the first time since stepping off that train, Mei Lin felt like she had found not just a safe harbor, but a home worth defending. The territorial judge arrived on a Thursday morning with all the ceremony of a funeral procession. Judge William Thornfield was a thin, severe man with steel gray hair and the kind of pale eyes that seemed to see moral failing in everything they surveyed. Sheriff Clayton met him at the train station with obvious satisfaction, while half the town gathered to watch the proceedings that everyone knew would determine not just the fate of one marriage, but the question of who belonged in Silver Creek and who didn't. Malin watched from the ranch house window as the dust cloud of their approach grew larger on the horizon. She'd spent the morning preparing, not just her appearance, but her arguments. If they wanted to question her right to be Caleb's wife, she would meet their challenge with every ounce of intelligence and dignity she possessed. You don't have to do this, Caleb said for the 12th time as he checked his pocket watch. We could still leave, head to California, start over where people might be more accepting, and spend the rest of our lives running from ignorant men who think they have the right to define love? Malin shook her head firmly. No, if we're going to build a life together, it needs to be built on solid ground, not on the shifting sand of other people's approval. The hearing was held in the Silver Creek Community Hall, with what seemed like the entire town crammed into the small space. Malin felt the weight of dozens of hostile stares as she and Caleb made their way to the front, but she kept her chin high and her expression serene. She had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only weapon available to the powerless. Judge Thornfield called the proceedings to order with theatrical gravity. We are here today to examine the validity of the marriage between Caleb Morgan and... He consulted his papers with distaste, Mei Lin Chen Morgan, in light of concerns raised by upstanding citizens of this community regarding the propriety and legality of such a union. Sheriff Clayton stood to present the case against them, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of a man who believed he was defending civilization itself. Your Honor, this marriage represents a dangerous precedent. Allowing Chinese women to marry white men threatens the moral fabric of our community and opens the door to all manner of foreign influences that have no place in decent Christian society. And what specific laws do you claim this marriage violates? Judge Thornfield asked. Clayton shuffled his papers nervously. Well, Your Honor, while Montana Territory doesn't have explicit anti-miscegenation laws, there are precedents from California and other states that establish the unnaturalness of such unions. Furthermore, there are questions about whether this woman entered into the marriage under false pretenses, given her deceptive presentation of her capabilities. Malin felt her temper flare at the implication, but Caleb's steady hand on her arm reminded her to remain calm. They had discussed strategy, let their opponents make their case first, reveal their ignorance and prejudice, then respond with facts and dignity. Mrs. Morgan, Judge Thornfield addressed her directly, his tone suggesting he expected to hear broken English and confused responses. Do you understand the serious nature of these proceedings? Mei Lin rose gracefully, her voice clear and unaccented when she spoke. I understand perfectly, Your Honor. I understand that some people in this community are uncomfortable with the idea of a Chinese woman choosing her own husband and building an American life on her own terms. I understand that this discomfort has led them to question not the legality of our marriage, which is unquestionably valid under territorial law, but the morality of their own prejudices. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was electric with surprise. This was not the submissive, barely speaking woman that Silver Creek's gossip mill had described. You speak English very well for someone who allegedly misrepresented her abilities, Judge Thornfield observed. I never misrepresented anything, Your Honor. I simply allowed people to make assumptions based on their own limited expectations. Malin's smile was polite but sharp. A mistake I will not make again. Dr. Hayes stood from the crowd. Your Honor, if I may speak as a character witness, I've had occasion to observe this couple's relationship, and I can attest to the genuine nature of their partnership. Mrs. Morgan has proven herself to be a woman of exceptional intelligence and moral character. And I can speak to her contributions to our community, Maria Gonzalez added, rising despite the disapproving looks from her neighbors. She has shown nothing but kindness and respect to everyone she's met, even those who have treated her poorly. But Sheriff Clayton wasn't finished. Your Honor, regardless of her personal qualities, the fact remains that this union goes against natural law and Christian teaching. The Bible itself speaks against the mixing of peoples. The Bible speaks of many things, Sheriff, interrupted a new voice from the back of the hall. Everyone turned to see Father O'Malley, the elderly Catholic priest who served the town's small Irish population. It speaks of love, compassion, and the fundamental equality of all souls before God. Perhaps you should focus on those passages instead of twisting Scripture to justify your own discomfort. The tide of the room was shifting, and Judge Thornfield seemed to sense it. He turned his attention back to Caleb. Mr. Morgan, you've heard the concerns raised about your marriage. What is your response? Caleb stood, and Malin was struck by how tall and solid he looked, how unmovable in his convictions. Your Honor, I married Mei Lin because I wanted a partner in life, not a servant or an ornament. She has exceeded every hope I had for companionship, and she's made me a better man than I was before. If the law says our marriage is valid, which it does, then I don't see how anyone else's comfort or discomfort matters. And if the social pressures prove too great, if your neighbors continue to object to your wife's presence, then we'll deal with it together, Caleb replied firmly. But we won't be bullied into abandoning our home or our marriage because some people can't see past the color of her skin to the content of her character. Judge Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers before him. Finally, he looked up at the assembled crowd. I find no legal basis for challenging this marriage, he announced. The union between Caleb Morgan and Mei Lin Chen Morgan was properly conducted according to territorial law, and is therefore valid and binding. Furthermore, I would remind everyone present that this is America, where people are free to choose their own paths in life, regardless of their origins. The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Malin felt Caleb's arm around her waist, anchoring her as the chaos swirled around them. They had won, but she knew the victory was only legal. The social battle would continue. As they made their way through the crowd toward the door, Sheriff Clayton blocked their path, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Law or no law, decent folks know what's right and what's wrong. You'll find that living in a place where you're not wanted can be mighty uncomfortable." Before Caleb could respond, Maylin stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Sheriff Clayton, in China we have a proverb. The tree that would grow tall does not waste time cursing the stones in the soil. You may see me as a stone in your path, but I prefer to think of myself as a tree. And trees, Sheriff, have a way of outlasting the storms that try to uproot them." The simple dignity of her words seemed to deflate his bluster. As they walked out of the hall and into the afternoon sunlight, Maylin felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving her grandmother's house in Canton. The certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. But their relief was short-lived. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, they saw smoke rising from the direction of town. "That's not a chimney fire," Caleb said grimly, reaching for the rifle he'd taken to keeping nearby. They rode into Silver Creek to find the Gonzalez Cantina in flames, with Maria and Eduardo standing helplessly as their livelihood burned. The volunteer fire brigade was notably absent, despite the church bell ringing the alarm. "Maria!" Maylin dismounted and ran to her friend, wrapping her arms around the sobbing woman. "What happened?" "They said it was an accident," Eduardo answered bitterly. "But accidents don't usually involve broken windows and coal oil splashed on the walls." The message was clear. Supporting the Chinese woman and her husband came with a price. As they helped the Gonzalez family salvage what they could from the ruins, Maylin realized that Judge Thornfield's legal validation had only made their real enemies more desperate. The law might recognize her marriage, but that wouldn't stop those who saw her very existence as a threat to their vision of what America should be. "What now?" she asked Caleb as they drove home through the darkness, the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes. "Now we prepare," he replied grimly, "because if they think burning down our friends' businesses will make us run, they're about to learn how wrong they are." The war for their right to love each other was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The week following the Cantina fire transformed Silver Creek into a town divided against itself. Lines were drawn not in the dirt, but in the choices people made. Who they would serve, who they would defend, and what kind of community they wanted to live in. Maylin and Caleb found themselves at the center of a storm that had little to do with them personally and everything to do with the kind of America that was emerging from the ashes of the old frontier. Their ranch became an unofficial headquarters for what Dr. Hayes privately called the decent folks. Maria and Eduardo Gonzalez had moved into the spare room after losing their cantina, and their presence filled the house with the warm sense of chilies and corn masa. Father O'Malley rode out daily to check on them, his Irish brogue a comforting counterpoint to the tension that seemed to permeate everything. "It's not about you, you know," he told Maylin one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching Caleb and Eduardo repair fence posts. "Oh, they tell themselves it is. But this fight has been brewing for years. You just gave them something specific to focus their fear on." Their fear of what? Change. Progress. The idea that America might be big enough for all kinds of people to make good lives. Father O'Malley's eyes were thoughtful as he watched the two men work together with easy camaraderie. "Some folks can't imagine prosperity that doesn't require someone else's suffering." Maylin nodded, understanding more than the priest might have expected. "In China, we have a saying, when the small-minded cannot rise up, they try to pull others down. I had hoped America might be different." "America is different," Father O'Malley said firmly, "but that doesn't mean it's finished becoming what it's supposed to be. Sometimes good people have to fight for the difference to matter." That fight was taking many forms. Dr. Hayes had quietly organized a boycott of Henderson's General Store, leading to the establishment of a small trading post at the Gonzalez's temporary location. Several ranch families had made it clear that they stood with Caleb and would defend his property if necessary. Even some of the younger men in town, particularly those who'd served in the war and seen enough senseless violence, had begun speaking out against the intimidation tactics. But Sheriff Clayton and his supporters weren't idle either. A series of accidents had plagued the supporters of the Morgan marriage: fences cut, livestock scattered, tools mysteriously broken. The message was clear: supporting the Chinese woman and her husband would cost you. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening when Tom Bradley, a young cowhand who'd spoken favorably of Mei Lin in the saloon, was found beaten unconscious behind the livery stable. Dr. Hayes worked over him for hours, but the damage was severe: broken ribs, a shattered wrist, and injuries that suggested the attack had been both vicious and methodical. "They're not just trying to scare us anymore," Caleb said grimly as he and Mei Lin sat vigil by Tom's bedside. "They're trying to break us." "Then we show them we don't break," Mei Lin replied, but her voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. The constant tension, the knowledge that their very existence was causing suffering to good people, was taking its toll. Caleb reached over and took her hand, noting how thin it had become over the past weeks. "Maybe we should reconsider leaving. Not because we're giving in, but because I can't stand watching what this is doing to you." "What it's doing to me?" Malin's eyes flashed with something between anger and hurt. "Caleb, if we run now, what happens to Maria and Eduardo? To Dr. Hayes? To everyone who stood up for us? Do you think Clayton and his friends will just forget and forgive?" "Of course not, but—" "Then we stay. We fight. We prove that love is stronger than hate, even when hate comes with torches and clubs." Their conversation was interrupted by Eduardo bursting through the door, his face grim with urgency. "Caleb, you need to see this. Now." Outside, the night sky was lit by an ominous orange glow coming from the direction of town. But this wasn't another accident. This was organized, purposeful, and heading their way. A line of torches was moving across the prairie like a river of fire, and even from a distance they could hear voices raised in the kind of mob chant that had preceded lynchings and burnings throughout the territory's short history. "How many?" Caleb asked, already reaching for his rifle. "Maybe 30, 40 men," Eduardo replied. "They've got Clayton leading them, and they're armed for more than just intimidation." Mei Lin felt ice form in her stomach. This was no longer about legal challenges or economic pressure. This was about violence, pure and simple, and the kind of hatred that reasoned argument couldn't touch. "Get Maria and the others into the root cellar," she told Eduardo, "and make sure Tom is moved somewhere safe." "What about you?" "I'm staying with my husband." Malin's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This is our home, and we defend it together." As the torches drew closer, their defenders began to arrive. Dr. Hayes with his hunting rifle, Father O'Malley carrying a shotgun that looked older than Ireland itself, and nearly a dozen ranch hands and farmers who'd decided that enough was enough. "Caleb Morgan!" Clayton's voice carried across the night air as the mob stopped just outside rifle range. "Send out that Chinese whore, and maybe we'll let you live." The crude words hit Mei Lin like physical blows, but Caleb's response was immediate and deadly calm. "Sheriff Clayton, you're trespassing on private property with armed men. Either state your legal business or get off my land." "Our business is cleaning up this community," Clayton shouted back. "That woman doesn't belong here, and neither does anyone who supports her." "Then you'd better bring a lot more men, Doctor," Hayes called out, his rifle glinting in the torchlight. "Because there are plenty of us who think differently." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 30 yards of Montana prairie separated two visions of America, one built on fear and exclusion, the other on hope and inclusion. In the flickering torchlight, Mei Lin could see faces twisted with hatred and faces set with determination. "Last chance, Morgan," Clayton yelled. "Send her out or we'll come take her." Mei Lin stepped forward before Caleb could stop her, moving into the circle of light cast by their own lanterns. Her voice carried clearly across the distance when she spoke, each word precise and unafraid. "I am Mei Lin Chen Morgan, citizen of Montana Territory and wife to Caleb Morgan. I came to this country seeking freedom, and I found love. If you want to take that from me, then come ahead. But know that you'll have to kill every person standing here, because we will not surrender to your hatred." The power of her words, delivered with such quiet dignity in the face of a howling mob, seemed to steal some of the wind from Clayton's sails. Several of his followers shifted nervously, perhaps beginning to realize what they'd actually signed up for. But Clayton himself was past the point of rational thought. With a wordless roar of rage, he spurred his horse forward, his gun already drawn. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that comes in moments of life and death. Caleb's rifle cracked once, and Clayton tumbled from his saddle. The mob charged, their torches arcing through the night like falling stars. And Maylin Chen Morgan, who had traveled 8,000 miles to find freedom in America, stood her ground and fought for it with everything she had. The battle for Silver Creek, and for the soul of the America that was still becoming, had finally begun. The battle for Silver Creek lasted less than 10 minutes, but those minutes would be talked about for generations. What began as a mob attack quickly devolved into chaos as Clayton's followers realized they were facing not helpless victims, but determined defenders who had everything to lose and nothing left to fear. Maylin fought with a fury that surprised even herself, wielding Caleb's backup rifle with deadly precision, while her husband and their allies held the main line. She moved through the darkness like a ghost, using every bit of cunning her grandmother had taught her about surviving in a hostile world. When one of Clayton's men tried to circle around to torch the house, he found himself facing a Chinese woman who had learned that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to fight for it. "Behind you!" Maria called from her position at an upstairs window, and Maylin spun just in time to see another attacker raising his rifle. Her shot took him in the shoulder, sending him sprawling into the dirt with a scream of pain and surprise. The tide turned when several of Clayton's own men began to recognize the futility of their cause. Faced with organized resistance from people they'd known as neighbors and friends, some of the mob began to melt away into the darkness. Others, caught up in the violence they'd helped create, fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. Clayton himself, wounded but not killed by Caleb's shot, rallied his remaining followers for one last desperate charge toward the house. But he'd underestimated both the determination of the defenders and the character of his own men. When the moment came for them to commit murder in cold blood, for that's what it would take to reach Maylin and Caleb, half of them simply couldn't do it. "This is madness," one of them shouted, throwing down his torch. "These are our neighbors, for God's sake." "Our neighbors," Clayton snarled, blood running down his arm from Caleb's bullet. "That Chinese witch has poisoned half the town against decent folk." "The only poison here is in your heart, Clayton, Doctor," Hayes called from his position behind the water trough. "And it's killing everything good about this community." The words seemed to galvanize something in the remaining attackers. Perhaps they realized that, Doctor. Hayes was right, that they'd allowed fear and hatred to turn them into the very thing they claimed to be fighting against. Or perhaps they simply recognized that the battle was already lost, that the principles they were fighting for weren't worth the blood they were shedding. One by one, they began to lay down their weapons and step back from the fight. Within minutes, Clayton found himself standing almost alone in the circle of torchlight, his remaining supporters looking more like prisoners than soldiers. "Cowards," he screamed at his departing followers. "Yellow-bellied cowards, every one of you." "No," Maylin said, stepping into the light with her rifle still trained on him. "They're Americans, and Americans don't murder their neighbors because they're different." Clayton's eyes blazed with hatred as he raised his gun toward her, but Caleb's voice stopped him cold. "Clayton," the single word carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You point that gun at my wife, and I'll put you in the ground right where you stand." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the battlefield of their own making. Then Clayton seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him all at once. His gun hand dropped to his side, and he looked around at the scene of devastation with something that might have been comprehension. "This ain't over," he said finally, but the words carried no conviction. "Yes, it is," Maylin replied gently. "It's over, Sheriff. The question now is what kind of community we're going to build from what's left." Dawn broke over Silver Creek like a benediction, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to wash away the darkness of the night before. The surviving members of Clayton's mob had scattered to the winds, and the sheriff himself had been placed under citizen's arrest pending the arrival of the territorial marshal. But the real victory wasn't in the defeat of their enemies, it was in what happened next. As word of the battle spread throughout the territory, Silver Creek found itself flooded with visitors. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the town where a Chinese woman and her allies had faced down a mob. Others came with more practical purposes, merchants looking for new opportunities, families seeking a place where different kinds of people could build lives together, and immigrants from a dozen different countries who'd heard that Silver Creek might be different from other frontier towns. The rebuilt cantina became the unofficial community center, where Maria Gonzalez served food that blended Mexican, Chinese, Irish, and American traditions into something entirely new. Father O'Malley began conducting services in 3 languages, while Dr. Hayes found himself treating patients who spoke half a dozen different tongues. The general store, now run by a cooperative of families rather than the Hendersons who left town in disgrace, carried goods that reflected the community's growing diversity. But the most profound changes were in the hearts of the people themselves. The violence had forced everyone to choose sides, and in making those choices, they discovered what they truly valued. The Silver Creek that emerged from the ashes of that night was stronger, more vibrant, and more truly American than the insular community it had replaced. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that painted the mountains in shades of flame and gold, Mei Lin stood in her kitchen preparing dumplings for the community harvest celebration. The technique was one her grandmother had taught her, but the filling was pure Montana. Beef from Caleb's cattle, vegetables from their garden, and spices that Maria had suggested. Perfect fusion, she murmured to herself, smiling at the metaphor. What's perfect fusion? Caleb asked, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and pressing a kiss to her temple. These dumplings. This life. Us. Malin leaned back against his chest, marveling at how completely safe and loved she felt in his embrace. A year ago, I thought I was coming to America to hide from who I was. Instead, I learned to become who I was always meant to be. And who's that? A bridge, she said simply, between worlds, between cultures, between the America that was and the America that could be. Through the window, they could see their neighbors arriving for the celebration, the Gonzalez family with their children laughing and playing, Father O'Malley deep in conversation with the new Buddhist temple's visiting monk, Dr. Hayes helping an elderly Scandinavian couple from their wagon. The diversity that had once terrified some of the townspeople had become Silver Creek's greatest strength. Do you ever miss it? Caleb asked. The life you left behind? Malin considered the question seriously. I miss my grandmother's wisdom. I miss the sound of Cantonese in the marketplace, the smell of jasmine tea in the morning, the certainty of knowing exactly where I belonged in the world. But I don't miss being told that my dreams were too big for a woman. I don't miss arranging my life around other people's expectations. And I definitely don't miss believing that love was something that happened to you rather than something you chose every day. Caleb turned her in his arms so he could see her face. And do you choose it? Every day? Every day, she confirmed, standing on her toes to kiss him. Even the hard days, especially the hard days. As the celebration got underway outside, with music and laughter and the delicious chaos of different cultures trying to understand each other, Malin and Caleb joined their friends and neighbors in the yard. The harvest had been good, the community was thriving, and the future stretched ahead of them like an open road full of possibilities. Later, as they sat around the fire listening to old Irish songs and new American stories, someone asked Malin to tell them about her journey to Silver Creek. She'd told the story many times before, but tonight she found herself focusing on different details, not just the hardships and the fear, but the moment of recognition when she'd first looked into Caleb's eyes and seen a future worth fighting for. The bravest thing I ever did, she concluded, wasn't leaving China or facing down that mob. It was stepping off that train and choosing to trust that love could be stronger than fear. And was it? Asked one of the children who'd been listening with rapt attention. Malin looked around the circle of faces, some Asian, some European, some Mexican, some born here, and some who traveled thousands of miles to find home. She saw in each of them the same thing she'd seen in Caleb's eyes that first day, the courage to believe that America could be big enough for all kinds of dreams. Yes, she said simply, love was stronger than fear, but only because we chose to make it so. As the fire died down and the celebration drew to a close, Malin and Caleb walked hand in hand back to their house. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with stars that seemed to whisper promises of all the tomorrows yet to come. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying new dreamers toward Silver Creek, and the chance to discover what happened when different worlds chose to build something beautiful together. Malin squeezed Caleb's hand and smiled. Some journeys ended exactly where they were supposed to begin, and in Silver Creek, Montana, where East had met West and chosen love over fear, every ending was just a new beginning waiting to unfold. And there you have it, Malin Chen's extraordinary journey from a frightened young woman stepping off a train in the 1880s America to becoming the heart and soul of a transformed community. Her story reminds us that the greatest love stories aren't just about two people finding each other. They're about how love can ripple outward to heal entire communities and shape the future for generations to come. What strikes me most about Malin's transformation is how she went from hiding her intelligence and culture to becoming the bridge that connected different worlds. She arrived in Silver Creek pretending to be someone smaller than she was, only to discover that America at its best doesn't ask people to diminish themselves. It asks them to contribute their unique gifts to the collective dream. Caleb's journey is equally powerful. He thought he wanted a simple, quiet wife who would make his life easier, but instead found a brilliant partner who challenged him to become the man he was meant to be. Their relationship shows us that the best marriages aren't built on false expectations, but on the courage to see and accept each other's true selves, even when those selves are more complicated than we bargained for. But this story is about more than just individual transformation. It's about what happens when communities choose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion. Silver Creek's evolution from a divided, fearful town to a thriving multicultural haven proves that diversity isn't a threat to American values. It is an American value, one that makes us stronger when we embrace it. The battle scene reminds us that defending love and acceptance sometimes requires real courage. When Sheriff Clayton and his mob came with torches and hatred, it would have been easy for Malin and Caleb to run, to choose safety over principle. Instead, they stood their ground, supported by neighbors who proved that good people will fight for what's right when the stakes are high enough. Perhaps most beautiful of all is how the story ends. Not with Malin abandoning her Chinese heritage, or Caleb becoming someone he's not, but with both of them creating something entirely new together. Those fusion dumplings filled with Montana beef aren't just food. They're a perfect metaphor for what America can be when we stop seeing differences as threats and start seeing them as ingredients for something richer and more beautiful. The cyclical ending, with another train bringing new dreamers to Silver Creek, reminds us that the work of building an inclusive society is never finished. Every generation faces the choice between fear and love, between building walls and building bridges. Malin's story shows us what's possible when we choose bridges. What resonated most with you in Malin and Caleb's story? Have you ever had to choose between hiding who you are and risking rejection for being authentic? Have you witnessed a community transform from suspicion to acceptance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing how these frontier love stories connect with your own experiences of finding belonging. If this tale of courage, cultural fusion, and chosen family touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love truly can conquer fear, but only when we're brave enough to choose it every single day. Your support helps us continue bringing you these incredible stories of transformation and hope from America's frontier past. Speaking of transformation, next week we're exploring a story that will challenge everything you think you know about redemption and second chances. Picture this. A former outlaw turned preacher arrives in a peaceful town to build a church, but the local sheriff recognizes him as the man who killed his brother during a bank robbery 5 years ago. Now these two men must choose between the justice of revenge and the mercy of forgiveness. Can faith truly change a man's heart? Or are some sins too deep to forgive? Join us next time for The Preacher's Redemption, a story of faith tested by fury, where two broken men discover that sometimes the hardest person to forgive is the one staring back at you in the mirror. You won't want to miss this powerful exploration of grace and redemption set against the unforgiving backdrop of the American frontier. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our weekly journeys into the heart of the Wild West, where broken hearts learn to heal and every story proves that it's never too late to choose love over fear, hope over hatred, and bridges over walls. Until next time, remember that America's greatest strength has always been its ability to transform strangers into neighbors, differences into gifts, and separate stories into one beautiful, complicated, magnificent whole. This is Wild West Stories, where courage meets love on the American frontier.